Some people are alone because they were rejected. Others are alone because they saw too much. And society reacts very differently to the second type. There is a critical psychological distinction most people never learn to make the difference between being alone because you were excluded and being alone because you withdrew. On the surface, both conditions look identical. The person has fewer connections, less visible social activity, a quieter life, but inwardly, these two states could not be more different. Social exile is imposed from the outside. It is the result of rejection, misunderstanding, neglect, or incompatibility. The individual wants entry, wants resonance, wants to be seen, but finds no open door. This form of loneliness carries hunger in it. It aches. It looks outward for relief. The psyche in exile remains oriented toward the group, even in its absence. Chosen solitude, by contrast, is an inward turning. It emerges not from rejection, but from discernment. At some point, the individual begins to sense that their outer relationships no longer reflect their inner reality. Conversations feel rehearsed. Bonds feel conditional. The cost of belonging starts to outweigh the benefit. What follows is not bitterness, but withdrawal. This withdrawal is often misunderstood, especially by those who have never experienced it. From the outside, it appears antisocial, cold, or even arrogant. But psychologically, it is neither. It is a movement toward coherence. The individual is no longer willing to fragment themselves to remain acceptable. Most people never reach this stage because it requires something rare, the capacity to tolerate oneself without distraction. The average person uses relationships not only for connection, but for regulation. Others absorb anxiety, confirm identity, dull self-doubt. Without constant interaction, unresolved material rises to the surface. Chosen solitude removes that buffer. This is why it feels dangerous not to the one who chooses it, but to those who witness it. A person who stands apart without resentment quietly exposes a question many prefer. Not to ask what part of my social life is genuine and what part is avoidance. Groups are instinctively suspicious of individuals who do not need them. Not because those individuals threaten the group's survival, but because they threaten its illusions. Belonging often rests on unspoken agreements. Don't disrupt the emotional tone. Don't challenge the shared assumptions. Don't individuate too loudly. The solitary individual breaks these agreements simply by existing outside them. This is where projection begins. Instead of confronting their own dependence on validation, people assign motives to the solitary figure. They must think they are better. They must be hiding something. They must be damaged. These interpretations are defensive. They protect the group from having to examine its own fragility. What is rarely acknowledged is that chosen solitude is not permanent isolation. It is a transitional space, a psychological wilderness where the individual sheds borrowed identities and unconscious loyalties. Old values are questioned. Old ambitions lose their charge. The inner voice, long drowned out by expectation, becomes audible again. This phase is uncomfortable, even frightening. Without social mirrors, the personality destabilizes. One must face contradictions, shadow elements, unlived impulses. Many retreat back to familiar relationships at this point, not because those relationships are nourishing, but because they are known. Those who remain endure a kind of inner reorganization. Their sense of self becomes less reactive, less dependent. When they eventually reconnect with others, it is no longer from need, but from choice. Fewer relationships survive this shift, but those that do carry more truth. Social exile weakens the individual because it keeps desire pointed outward. Chosen solitude strengthens because it redirects energy inward. One seeks rescue, the other seeks alignment. The tragedy is that society often treats both states as the same. Anyone alone is assumed to be lacking. Anyone without a wide circle is seen as incomplete. This misunderstanding pressures people to abandon necessary solitude prematurely, forcing themselves back into relationships that no longer fit. But psychological development does not occur in crowds. It requires silence, friction, and distance. It requires stepping out of the familiar long enough to discover what remains when approval is removed. Chosen solitude is not a rejection of others. It is a refusal to live falsely. It is the space where the individual stops performing, and starts listening. It is not a sign of superiority, but of readiness for a different kind of connection, one not based on fear of exclusion, but on inner congruence and the willingness to meet another without needing to disappear into them when someone has no friends and seems unbothered. It quietly asks a terrifying question: what if I don't actually need all this noise either? There is a particular discomfort people experience around certain individuals that is difficult to name and even harder to admit. It is not caused by aggression, arrogance, or obvious hostility. In fact, it often arises in the presence of someone quiet, self-contained, and emotionally unmoved by the usual social currents. This discomfort does not come from what that person does, but from what they reflect. The unsettling mirror effect begins when an individual encounters someone who appears whole without constant external affirmation, someone who does not chase attention, approval, or belonging, someone who is not performing urgency in their relationships. This presence quietly disrupts an unspoken assumption most people live by: that connection is necessary at all times to feel real. Human identity is largely reinforced through reflection. We learn who we are by how others respond to us. Approval confirms existence. Rejection threatens it. Over time, relationships become psychological mirrors that stabilize the self. Without them, many people feel vague, anxious, or undefined. Social life becomes a way to maintain internal balance. When someone appears not to need this system, it destabilizes those who do. The unsettling mirror effect does not arise because the solitary person judges others. It arises because their existence poses a silent question: what if the constant need for validation is not inevitable? What if it is a strategy, not a truth? This question is deeply threatening because it shifts responsibility inward. If another person can remain intact without constant reassurance, then perhaps dependency is not fate, but habit. And habits, once seen, demand choice. Most people are not prepared for that. Instead of confronting the anxiety this realization produces, the psyche looks for a way to neutralize it. The simplest solution is projection. Qualities the observer cannot tolerate in themselves are assigned to the other. The independent person becomes labeled as cold. The quiet person becomes assumed arrogant. The withdrawn person is imagined to be wounded, defective, or secretly bitter. These interpretations serve a protective function. They restore the familiar hierarchy. Those who belong are healthy. Those who stand apart are flawed. The mirror is covered and the discomfort subsides. But the reaction persists precisely because it is not rational. There is no concrete behavior to justify the unease. The solitary person may be polite, restrained, even kind. Still, something about them lingers in the observer's mind. A faint irritation, a subtle defensiveness, a need to explain them away. This is the mirror at work. What is being reflected is not superiority or rejection, but possibility. The possibility of being less entangled, less reactive, less dependent on constant social feedback to feel legitimate. For someone whose identity is tightly interwoven with approval, this possibility feels like erosion. The unsettling mirror effect is strongest in environments built on conformity. Groups, workplaces, social circles where unspoken norms govern behavior rely on emotional synchronization. Agreement is rewarded. Dissonance is quietly punished. Someone who does not emotionally synchronize, who remains centered regardless of group mood, interrupts this rhythm. They are not disruptive by action, but by presence. This interruption exposes how much effort goes into maintaining social equilibrium, the laughter that is expected, the opinions that are softened, the truths that are withheld to preserve harmony. Seeing someone who does not seem burdened by these calculations brings awareness to one's own compromises. And awareness is uncomfortable. It is important to understand that the unsettling mirror effect is not evidence of moral failure or weakness. It is a natural response to an unexpected challenge to the self-image. Most people have never learned to exist without being constantly reflected by others. When that reflection is removed or shown to be optional, anxiety fills the gap. Rather than asking why, the solitary person feels complete. The observer asks what must be wrong with them. This is why people who are inwardly anchored often attract contradictory reactions. They are simultaneously admired and resented. Curiosity mixes with suspicion. Others feel drawn to them, but also uneasy in their presence. The mirror both invites and repels. The deeper function of this effect is transformative, though rarely welcomed. It reveals where identity is externally propped up rather than internally integrated. It highlights the difference between connection as nourishment and connection as anesthesia. Those who recognize the mirror may begin to question their patterns. They may notice how often they seek reassurance, how quickly silence becomes intolerable, how relationships are used to escape rather than to relate. This recognition does not immediately liberate them, but it introduces friction into automatic behavior. Others reject the mirror entirely. They reinforce their narratives, tighten their social bonds, and distance themselves from anything that threatens their sense of normalcy. The solitary figure becomes an object lesson rather than an invitation. In both cases, the mirror has done its work. The unsettling mirror effect is not about loneliness. It is about autonomy. It is about what happens when a person demonstrates, without explanation or apology, that identity does not collapse in the absence of constant affirmation, and that the self can remain intact, coherent, and present even when no one is watching. There is a stage in inner development where shallow connections become unbearable, and most people never reach it. Groups are formed to create stability. They reduce uncertainty by establishing shared norms, values, and emotional rhythms. Within a group, behavior becomes predictable, roles become defined. An identity is reinforced through belonging. This structure is comforting, especially in a world that constantly threatens disorder, but the same structure that provides safety also produces suspicion toward those who do not fully conform to it. The individuated mind unsettles groups, not because it is aggressive or oppositional, but because it is internally anchored. It does not rely on collective approval to maintain coherence. This independence disrupts the group's unspoken assumption that belonging is necessary for psychological survival. Most groups function through emotional synchronization. Members unconsciously adjust their opinions, tone, and even inner reactions to maintain cohesion. Agreement is often less about truth and more about stability. Disagreement, especially when expressed calmly and without emotional charge, introduces instability. It signals that alignment is not automatic. The individuated individual does not mirror the group's emotional state reflexively. They may listen without rushing to affirm. They may question without seeking to dominate. They may remain silent where others perform agreement. This lack of synchronization is deeply unsettling because it exposes the mechanics of group cohesion. Groups prefer visible conflict to quiet autonomy. Open rebellion can be identified, confronted, and neutralized. Silent independence is harder to manage. It does not declare itself as an enemy, yet it refuses absorption. This refusal triggers a primitive anxiety within the collective, the fear of fragmentation. To preserve unity, groups develop informal mechanisms of control. These include ridicule, moral framing, exclusion, and subtle pressure to conform. The individuated mind often becomes the target of these mechanisms, not because it violates explicit rules, but because it does not internalize the group's authority. This is why such individuals are often labeled in contradictory ways. They are called arrogant yet distant, dangerous yet passive, intelligent yet socially deficient. These labels are attempts to categorize what cannot be easily integrated. Once labeled, the threat feels manageable. The distrust arises because the individuated person embodies a truth the group depends on ignoring, that identity can exist outside collective reinforcement. If one person can think, feel, and act without constant reference to group approval, then the group's necessity becomes conditional rather than absolute. This realization weakens the psychological glue that holds the collective together. Groups also distrust the individuated mind because it resists emotional contagion. Moods spread quickly in collectives. Fear, outrage, enthusiasm, and certainty move through groups like currents. The individuated individual experiences these currents but is not carried by them. Their resistance highlights how automatic the process usually is. This resistance is not always conscious. It often stems from an inner alignment that has already been forged through self-examination. Such individuals have confronted their contradictions, acknowledged their shadow, and developed a tolerance for inner tension. As a result, they are less reactive to external pressure. Groups, however, rely on reactivity to enforce norms. Approval and disapproval are the primary tools of regulation. When these tools lose their effectiveness, the group experiences a loss of control. Distrust emerges as a defensive response. Another source of suspicion lies in the group's relationship to responsibility. In collectives, responsibility is diffused. Decisions are shared. Accountability is softened. The individuated mind, by contrast, tends to assume responsibility for its perceptions and choices. This can feel threatening to those who rely on the safety of shared judgment. The individuated individual cannot be easily mobilized for collective fantasies or scapegoating. They are less likely to participate in moral panics, idealization of leaders, or demonization of outsiders. This restraint can be misinterpreted as disloyalty. Groups often confuse loyalty with sameness. To belong is to echo, to support is to align. The individuated mind challenges this equation by demonstrating that commitment does not require conformity and that engagement does not demand self-erasure. Over time, groups may attempt to either absorb or expel such individuals. Absorption involves offering status in exchange for compliance. Expulsion takes the form of marginalization or quiet exclusion. Both strategies aim to restore equilibrium. What remains unspoken is that the individuated mind serves a vital function. It introduces reflection into systems prone to unconscious repetition. It slows down collective momentum long enough for awareness to enter. Without such minds, groups become echo chambers, amplifying their own assumptions until they collapse under their weight. The distrust of the individuated mind is not a flaw in groups, but a structural tension between belonging and autonomy. It reveals the cost of cohesion and the courage required to stand within or outside a collective without surrendering one's inner authority. Groups don't fear loneliness. They fear people who can stand alone without asking permission. Withdrawal is commonly mistaken for regression. When someone steps back from social life, reduces their circle, or chooses silence over participation, it is often interpreted as avoidance, fear, or emotional damage. In many cases, this interpretation is accurate, but there is another form of withdrawal that emerges not from weakness, but from development. Psychological maturity does not always express itself as expansion. In its early stages, growth looks like accumulation. More experiences, more relationships, more roles, more external validation. Identity is built outwardly, shaped by reaction and feedback. Over time, however, this outward movement reaches a limit. What once felt enriching begins to feel excessive. Stimulation turns into noise. Connection becomes dilution. At this point, the psyche initiates a different movement. Instead of seeking more, it begins to subtract. This withdrawal is not driven by fear of others, but by sensitivity to inner incongruence. The individual starts to notice the gap between who they appear to be and who they actually are. Social roles that once felt natural begin to feel performative. Conversations feel repetitive. Relationships feel maintained rather than lived. Continuing to participate under these conditions requires self-betrayal. Psychological maturity recognizes this cost and responds by pulling inward. Such withdrawal is rarely dramatic. It often happens quietly. Invitations are declined without explanation. Opinions are withheld rather than argued. Time once spent in social circulation is redirected toward reflection. From the outside, this looks like disengagement. From the inside, it feels like preservation. The mature psyche understands that constant exposure without integration leads to fragmentation. Without space to process experience, the self becomes reactive, shaped by the immediate emotional environment. Withdrawal creates a buffer. It slows down the cycle of stimulus and response, allowing meaning to emerge. This is why periods of solitude often accompany major internal shifts. Old values are questioned. Long-held beliefs lose their certainty. Ambitions are reevaluated. Without the pressure to perform identity for others, the individual can observe themselves more honestly. This stage is uncomfortable. Many discover aspects of themselves they would rather not see. Unacknowledged desires surface. Resentments become clear. Internal contradictions come into focus. Social engagement can distract from this work. Withdrawal makes it unavoidable. Those who mistake withdrawal for immaturity often equate health with visibility. To be engaged is to be healthy. To be quiet is to be suspect. But psychological maturity does not seek constant affirmation. It seeks coherence. And coherence requires silence. There's also an ethical dimension to mature withdrawal. As awareness deepens, the individual becomes more conscious of the subtle ways relationships are used for regulation rather than connection. Attention is sought to soothe anxiety. Agreement is extracted to stabilize identity. Withdrawal interrupts these patterns. By stepping back, the individual reduces the unconscious burden placed on others. They stop using relationships as emotional scaffolding. This does not mean rejecting connection, but refining it. Mature withdrawal often leads to fewer relationships, but more precise ones. The individual becomes selective, not out of superiority, but out of responsibility. Each connection carries weight. Each interaction demands presence. Superficial bonds are released because they cannot be sustained without pretense. This selectivity is frequently misinterpreted. Others may feel abandoned or judged. The withdrawing individual is accused of becoming distant, cold, or self-absorbed. In reality, they are attempting to align their outer life with their inner state. Psychological maturity involves recognizing limits. Limits of energy, limits of attention, limits of emotional availability. Withdrawal honors these limits rather than violating them to meet external expectations. Importantly, this form of withdrawal is not permanent isolation. It is cyclical. Engagement follows withdrawal, but in a different form. When the individual returns to connection, they do so with clearer boundaries and less need for validation. They speak less, but with greater intention. They listen more deeply. They tolerate disagreement without collapse. Their presence becomes less reactive and more grounded. In this way, withdrawal serves as a crucible. It strips away borrowed identities and unexamined habits. It forces the individual to confront themselves without distraction. What survives this confrontation is not larger, louder, or more impressive, but more integrated, more stable, and less dependent on the approval of others. The loner isn't feared for who they are, but for what they force others to confront in themselves. The human mind has a remarkable ability to avoid what it does not wish to see. Traits that threaten the self-image are not confronted directly, they are displaced. Instead of being recognized as internal possibilities, they are experienced as qualities belonging to others. This mechanism, known as shadow projection, operates quietly and continuously, shaping perception more than most people realize. The shadow consists of aspects of the personality that have been rejected, suppressed, or left undeveloped. These aspects are not inherently negative. They include impulses, desires, strengths, and vulnerabilities that did not fit the image a person learned to present. Because they remain unintegrated, they exist outside conscious identity, exerting influence without acknowledgement. Projection is the shadow's primary method of expression. When someone encounters a person who embodies a quality they have disowned, a strong emotional reaction often follows. The reaction may be admiration, irritation, fear, or moral outrage. The intensity of the response is the clue. Ordinary differences do not provoke obsession. Shadow material does. This is why certain individuals become lightning rods for judgment. They trigger reactions disproportionate to their behavior. A quiet person is accused of arrogance. An independent person is labeled selfish. A disciplined person is seen as rigid. These interpretations reveal more about the observer than the observed. Shadow projection protects the ego by locating unwanted traits externally. The individual preserves a coherent self-image. They can remain generous by condemning selfishness elsewhere. They can feel humble by denouncing arrogance in others. The inner conflict is resolved through outward blame. This mechanism is not limited to negative traits. Positive qualities are projected as well. Potential strength may be perceived as intimidation. Unlived creativity becomes envy. Repressed autonomy becomes suspicion. The individual encounters their own unrealized possibilities and experiences them as threats. Groups amplify shadow projection. Collectives depend on shared identity, and shared identity requires clear boundaries between what is acceptable and what is not. Individuals who do not conform easily become containers for disowned traits. They carry the group's shadow. This process explains why loners, nonconformists, and inwardly anchored individuals often attract exaggerated reaction. They do not play familiar roles. They do not offer predictable cues. Their ambiguity invites projection. The less is known about them, the more is imagined. Shadow projection is particularly strong when an individual appears self-contained. Someone who does not seek approval disrupts the unspoken hierarchy of validation. Others may experience this as a personal affront. Rather than confronting their own dependence, they attribute hostility or superiority to the other. The projected shadow becomes a story. The story feels true because it is emotionally charged. Evidence is selectively gathered to support it. Neutral actions are interpreted through a biased lens. Over time, the projection solidifies into conviction. The tragedy of shadow projection is that it prevents genuine perception. The projected person is no longer seen as they are, but as a screen for another's unresolved inner material. This distortion blocks authentic relationship and reinforces division. On an individual level, projection maintains psychological immaturity. By externalizing conflict, the individual avoids a difficult work of integration. They remain split with disowned parts operating unconsciously. Awareness narrows instead of expanding. On a collective level, projection fuels scapegoating. Groups offload anxiety, aggression, and guilt onto designated figures. These figures are blamed for problems they did not create. The group experiences temporary relief, but the underlying issues remain unresolved. Shadow projection can be interrupted, but not easily. It requires a willingness to examine emotional reactions rather than justify them. When an encounter provokes strong judgment, the mature response is not to act on it immediately, but to inquire inwardly. What quality is being activated? What does this reaction say about what has been denied? This inquiry threatens the ego. It destabilizes familiar narratives. It demands humility. Many prefer certainty to insight. Those who integrate their shadow become less reactive. They are less compelled to categorize others as enemies or ideals. They recognize traits in others without losing equilibrium. Difference becomes information rather than threat. Integration does not eliminate the shadow. It makes it conscious. The individual no longer needs to expel unwanted qualities into the world. Responsibility replaces blame. When shadow projection diminishes, perception becomes clearer. Relationships lose their dramatic charge. The compulsion to judge softens. The individual gains access to previously blocked energy and creativity. Those who remain unaware of their projections often experience the world as hostile or disappointing. Others are always wrong, dangerous, or disappointing. In reality, they are surrounded by reflections of what they have not yet accepted within themselves.